They said the land was theirs now. Papers signed, houses built, families moved in as if the Manuel owned it for generations never existed, but he did. And he watched as 35 homes rose in soil that carried his bloodline, his history, his dignity. When he tried to fight back, the system turned its back on him, dismissing his voice, ignoring his rights. But what they didn't know was that beneath this land, something powerful waited. And when he finally unleashed it, just rushing in, for generations, the land had been more than just soil. It was legacy. It was memory. It was stepless, where one man's grandfather planted seeds with his bare hands, where children once played under the shade of towering oaks, and where history itself seemed to rest quietly in the breeze. To him, this land was not simply was identity, inherited through sweat, struggle, and perseverance. He lived simply, close to the water that bordered his property. Each morning, he rose with the sun, walking along the dam that had stood for decades, keeping the river steady and the fields fertile. It was a routine that felt almost sacred, a rhythm of life tied to the earth itself. Neighbors would wave as he passed, some respectful, others indifferent. But to him, none of that mattered. The land was his, undeniably, unshakably his. Yet change was coming. At first, it was whisper surveyors marking boundaries, strangers driving by slowly, papers being exchanged somewhere in offices he had never stepped into, Honatist signs that made his chest tighten, new stakes in the ground, fresh chalk lines carved across fields he had always walked freely. Something felt wrong, but the details remained just out of reach. He could not yet see the storm gathering, but it was there, powerful forces moving behind closed doors, dismissing his heritage, dismissing his rights, and soon, he would realize that Thel and his family had fought to preserve was being taken. Piece by piece, without his voice, without his consent. The change came slowly, almost invisibly at first. Then, one morning, he woke to find bulldozers parked near the edge of his land, their metal claws biting into the earth. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Surely, no one could break ground without speaking to him, the rightful owner. But by end of that week, concrete foundations were already being poured. When he confronted the workers, they shrugged. Talk to the HOA, one muttered, as if those 3 letters explained everything. The Homeowners Association, a powerful body, made up of wealthy developers and well-connected officials, claimed the land was theirs now. They waved papers stamped with signatures and seals, documents he had never seen, claiming rights they had no moral ground to stand on. He tried to protest, tried to show his own deeds, proof that this land had been in his family for generations. But each time, the doors closed in his face. He went to City Hall. They sent him to the county office. The county sent him to lawyers who demanded money he didn't have. Every pathway to justice was blocked. It wasn't just a matter of bureaucracy, it was the quiet, suffocating weight of racism. His voice was dismissed before Heckle could even finish a sentence. His claims were met with polite nods and blank stares, as if his ownership, his history, his very presence didn't count. Week after week, houses rose higher. First 1, then 10, then 25. Families moved in, smiling and waving as if they were pioneers on new land, never questioning whose soil they were standing on. Every nail hammered into wood was like a blow to his chest. He watched strangers plant gardens where his ancestors had once labored, children play on ground his family had fought to keep, and still, the HOA pressed forward, emboldened by the silence of the system that should have protected him. He wrote letters that went unanswered. He stood before officials who dismissed him with a glance at his skin. His protests were drowned out by the sound of construction, louder, heavier, relentless. At night, he walked the dam. The water pressed against its walls, steady but strong, like a caged force waiting to be unleashed. He would pause there, staring at the current that rushed just beyond the barrier. The thought began, as a whisper: what if the river could speak for him? What if nature itself could remind them whose land they had stolen? The more he was ignored, the louder that whisper became. He thought of his grandfather's Galata's hands, of the stories passed down at the dinner table about survival and resilience. He thought of the injustice etched into his people's history, of the countless times land had been taken, voices silenced, rights stripped away. He had tried to play by their rules, but their rules were never made for him. Standing by the dam, the roar of the water beneath his feet, he realized something. The system wasn't broken, it was built this way. And if no one would hear his voice, then maybe they would hear the flood. The night he made his decision, The air was heavy with silence. The houses on his stolen land glowed with warm lights, families laughing behind glass windows, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But for him, every flicker of light was a reminder of what had been taken, not just property, but history, dignity, and voice. He walked the length of the dam slowly, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the roar of the river pressing against the wall. Each step felt like a heartbeat, steady, but growing louder, harder, more insistent. He thought of the papers that had dismissed him, the officials who had ignored him, the neighbors who pretended not to see his pain. He thought of his grandfather's voice telling him that land was sacred, that it carried the memory of those who came before. And now, those memories were buried beneath strangers' feet. The steel mechanism of the floodgate loomed before him, massive and unyielding. He placed his hands on the cold metal, feeling the vibration of the water straining. To be free, his chest tightened. This wasn't just anger, it was survival, the desperate cry of a man pushed beyond every limit. With one motion, he pulled, the gears groaned, the dam shuddered, and then it happened. Water surged forward with unstoppable force. The roar was deafening, a wall of nature unleashed, rushing across the land that had been stolen. Gardens vanished, streets drowned, and the carefully built houses stood powerless against the flood. For the first time in months, he didn't feel invisible. The river had spoken for him. It had carried his fury, his grief, his defiance. Justice, raw and unrelenting, swept through the very heart of what they had taken. And as he watched the waters rise, one thought cut through the chaos. They had ignored his voice, but could they ignore this? When the waters finally calmed, the land looked nothing like it had before. The manicured lawns, the neatly painted fences, the polished driveways, all were gone, swallowed by the force he had unleashed. What remained was raw earth, soaked and scarred, but honest in a way the false ownership had never been. He did not rejoice. There was no victory dance, no smile of satisfaction. Instead, he stood still, heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what had been proven. They had tried to erase him, to silence him, to bury his claim beneath paperwork and prejudice. But in the end, the flood had spoken louder than any signature or seal. The HOA called it destruction. The officials called it criminal. But for him, it was survival, a desperate act in a system that left him no other choice. His actions forced the world to look, even if only for a moment, to see not just one man's land being stolen, but the long history of black families stripped of what was theirs: land, wealth, dignity taken in broad daylight, justified by laws never written to protect them. His story was not just about a dam breaking. It was about the breaking point of a man pushed too far. It was about the weight of generations who had endured the same theft, the same silence, the same injustice. And as the waters receded, one truth remained clear. When voices are ignored, when justice is denied, the pressure builds, until finally, something gives. So the question is this: how many more dams must break before a system built on injustice finally changes?